Welcome, apprentices and acolytes. Today on Unlock the Knowledge, we're going to talk about the What If series rumored to be happening and the outlook it will have on the Star Wars stories. Ready up.
Ready up. My destiny.
Welcome, apprentices and acolytes, to Unlock the Knowledge, the podcast heard all around the galaxy for all the apprentices and acolytes coming into the Dark Temple, visited by Mara Jade, Luke Skywalker, and Kyle Katarn, and so many of the Force sensitives like yourself. I am Lord Dagovere, and welcome to the channel, welcome to the podcast, Unlock the Knowledge. I like to take just about anything lore, whatever's happened in the community, ideas, thoughts, process them all into this one podcast, and here we are. I'm not really a great YouTuber channel yet. I'm just trying to get there. I'm just a guy that loves talking about Star Wars, who ate lunch alone at school, and this is kind of like my cafeteria, right? This is like the lunch table that I am with all my friends, and talking about them with Star Wars, because that's something that I've always wanted, which ultimately made me create the channel. And so it's so funny, over the years that we've seen this, I've always thought about like the idea of, talking with other people, anything that's going on, through the what ifs, the what happened of all Star Wars. And now, funny enough, the rumor is going around about a potential what if series in Star Wars. And I think it's funny because I think when Marvel had created that series, there was a lot of people that liked the idea of that. I mean, I think that's actually kind of like the basis of all Star Wars projects. All Star Wars conversation is the idea of what if. What if Anakin Skywalker returned after sacrificing himself against Palpatine? What if Anakin never turned? That's like one of the main things I've always talked about with my friends, which I think so many prequel fans can understand, the idea of conversing with that, because we always talk about the potential of Anakin Skywalker, right? The idea of what Anakin Skywalker would have become if he never fell to the dark side, if he never lost his mother, if he was strong enough and wise enough to communicate well enough to listen to the council, to listen to Yoda, tell them about what Palpatine was telling him, tell them about the feelings that was going on. And maybe the council wasn't blind enough, the Shroud of the Dark Side wasn't destroying their ideology, the dogma that they finally were able to break out of. Those are things that I think that we could think about in what this story is going to tell. But before I get into that, I want to say that the reception so far that I've seen online has been, it's been kind of mixed, and I think it's kind of funny because recently everyone is so fixated on their beliefs, right? What they feel like Star Wars should or shouldn't be. And both sides of the fandom, as I was talking about, they often resort to negativity, whether it's like someone being negative about the things that they like, or people not wanting them to be fans of certain things. And everyone always says, oh, you can enjoy what you like, but is that really how they feel? Is that really? I'm not sure how it feels, just because how consistently people want to talk and put in their own take. And a lot of times, we talk about gatekeeping and things like that, but I do believe that gatekeeping is an opportunity for people to allow themselves or make themselves feel justified into attacking and harassing other people. This isn't always the case, but from what I've witnessed, from everyone else making content, whether it's positive or negative, it seems like a lot of times that can happen. And we've seen a lot of that recently with the what if takes. And there's a lot of people that were upset, specifically a lot of people that were inside the positive side of the fandom. And a lot of them were asking whether or not resources and things like that should even be, resorted and put into a project like this. And I understand the criticism, and I'm going to get to that. But specifically, there are strengths that we can see from the What If series. And the What If series has already been a thing in the Star Wars universe. In the expanded universe, there was Star Wars Infinities, which was fantastic comics that also did somewhat of what ifs. And I remember specifically one of the stories, I'm not sure if it's familiar to this, and it was a story about Vader going and hunting down everybody. And I think he even hunted down Yoda on Dagobah and actually destroyed Yoda. And then, of course, you think about the Star Wars Force Unleashed DLC back in the day, with Starkiller actually going around. He was the secret apprentice. I think he kills Chewbacca. I think he turns Luke to the dark side. It's a lot of crazy things that happen inside that story. And, you know, you could see what if kind of, use what Infinities had built and use that as a building block to create other stories off of. Because at the end of the day, what if is a great idea for Star Wars. And when you think about the what if stories that need to be told, yeah, what if Anakin Skywalker never fell to the dark side? What if his mother never died? What if Qui-Gon never landed on Naboo and never found Anakin? What if Luke Skywalker remained as a farm boy and a moisture farmer? What if Anakin never redeemed himself in Return of the Jedi? What if Palpatine won? What if Luke Skywalker turned to the dark side in Return of the Jedi? And of course, what if Finn became a Jedi in the sequel trilogy? I think that these are just the bare minimum of stories that we can see. Because that's the thing, is like when you think about Star Wars, it's not just the movies about the what ifs, the shoulda, wouldas, and the couldas that could have happened, right? And I always think about all of these things that you hear Paul Duncan talk about with Star Wars archives, and then you watch the original trilogy and you hear about, well, that line in Empire Strikes Back where Obi-Wan and Yoda are talking about, no, there is another. And it's not actually referring to Leia in that moment. It's actually referring to another family member or another Jedi that's being trained across the other galaxy, on the far side of the other galaxy. There were so many iterations of that. Of course, and then you think about also The Empire Strikes Back, about what if Obi-Wan Kenobi actually was the villain and Vader was not. It's things like that that you really start to think about, okay, maybe a what if series has something that it can give us. But here, specifically, that I'm always worried about these what if stories is multiverses. I don't like multiverses. I think multiverses is a comic book thing, is a Marvel thing, and I think that it should stay in that realm. I don't think Star Wars is great for multiverses, because Star Wars is beautiful and has its own value into the stories that it tells linear, right? In one direction, in two directions, right? But it's not really one direction. But anyway, I'm talking about the beginning of a timeline and the end of the timeline. And what's so beautiful about the end of the timeline is that there is no timeline in Star Wars. It just keeps going. For instance, and I'll talk about this in a second, is Star Wars Visions with the Ninth Jedi. The Ninth Jedi is so far forward in the non-canon realm of Star Wars that it can be canon. It's to a point where the Jedi have lost pretty much everything, and they don't even remember how to create lightsabers. It is a beautiful dynamic in creativity and storytelling that I don't feel like we get to see often in Star Wars these days. Because I do believe, while I am a positive creator, that a lot of stories lack one thing: creativity. But even then, even with something like Star Wars loses its value more than anything, any franchise, when it starts to retcon stories, when it starts to hit the reset button. And that's the one thing that Star Wars has over every other franchise, is that it doesn't need a reboot. You can just make stories further back in time, further forward in time. Yes, it's kind of like sweeping the dust under the rug until you finally realize it needs to be fixed. But at the end of the day, there's no rug or there's no dirt. You just keep making more Star Wars stories that help enhance other stories. For instance, like the Clone Wars animated series and how much help that did for the rest of the timeline in the prequel trilogy. For instance, Order 66 and the inhibitor chips. For instance, the clones, and then it fleshes out the clones, and then you see everything else. But then there's even more benefit to that, like Darth Maul's character and bringing him back, which is also a pretty risky thing to do, is to bring back these dead characters, right? And you see what I'm talking about now with why a what if series is good, but why Star Wars itself and its dynamic would honestly be a little bit counterproductive to the idea of a what if stories can bring. So you have the cons and you have the pros, right? You have the fors and against. And while I like this, I still think that Star Wars is stronger on its own, by itself, creating new original stories in the timeline itself. Because that's one thing that What If can't really do. It's like Star Wars Visions. And I think those two projects are so very similar, and Star Wars Visions is probably one of the best projects that we've ever gotten in anything Star Wars. Because like I was telling you, it was like the Japanese animation industry is incredibly creative. It's no holds bar. And they have so many unique takes because they're also fans, because majority of those creators were inspired by Star Wars. They have Star Wars to thank for bringing them into the film industry, for bringing them into the anime industry and animation. You can go watch the filmmaker focus in the extras for Disney Plus on the first season of Star Wars Visions, and so many of those directors that were in those anime studios that were responsible creating things like The Duel, the Ninth Jedi, The Village Bride, The Elder, a lot of them were honestly so overwhelmed in such a good way that they love Star Wars and that they wanted to create something like Star Wars. And that's the power that Star Wars has, because it's indirectly inspiring all of these creators to create something like it. And Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni actually had this really amazing take about, when you try to look at other Star Wars projects to inspire yourself, you're ultimately going to, repeat mistakes that were made in the franchise. And what they were getting at was that you have to find things that inspired Star Wars, and that's why they always go to the Japanese Kurosawa samurai films that were so incredibly well done. So you think about Yojimbo, you think about Seven Samurai, you think about Cub and Wolf, all of these specific samurai movies that have done this. And then of course, you think about the Western movies, things like that. There are so many versions of that help create such beautiful scenes that give Star Wars its feeling, right? It's attributes that make it so much different, so completely different from every other franchise in entertainment. And that's why I can't get hooked on every other franchise like I do with Star Wars, because something about that formula and that Japanese influence, that creativity, that is kind of etched in the DNA of Star Wars that we see. And Star Wars Visions is a beautiful manifestation of this. But with that beautiful manifestation, it's still a dream. It is not reality because it is not canon. It's not completely sewn in to the dimension of Star Wars, the universe of Star Wars that we know and love. It takes place somewhere else. And that's the problem with What If as well. Because you start throwing these stories that are not part of the true Star Wars story, I think it's going to be confusing. And I think it's going to be frustrating to the point where you're going to end up, maybe some people actually are going to like these things more. Maybe some people aren't going to like them as the past stuff. Because animation itself, I think people struggle to watch because a lot of people kind of have that issue whether or not, well, it's animation, it's for kids. It's animation, I don't really watch animation, it's not something, and then you have that bulk of the casual fan base, the larger broad form of the Star Wars universe and fans that aren't watching it because it is labeled animation. Does that mean if it's more powerful, it's live action? I think it should stay animation, to be honest, because I think that would bring in even more confusion. But at the end of the day, if you have those stories, the only thing that really gives them true value is making them canon, is making them a part of the story. And there are several stories in Star Wars Visions that I think, personally, can be part of the story. The Village Bride is one of them. The Village Bride takes place right after Order 66. That character can be so easily put into the rest of the Star Wars stories. That character can meet the Mandalorian right now. That character is still alive. The character that you see with the yellow lightsaber and the mask, she's probably around 16, 17 years old at the time of that event. And so she'd probably be around 30 plus around the Mandoverse timeline. Same thing with The Duel, right? And Ronin. The Duel in Ronin is probably one of the most gorgeous takes I've seen on Star Wars, not just the way it looks with Kamikaze Doga and their taste in animation and their style, but also the depiction of the story honestly reminds me of something that is often told at a campfire. And just like a campfire, what do you tell? Stories. Legends. That's what we brand, right? The no longer continuity. The previous expanded universe is legends. There are some truth in legends. And that's the idea of that Star Wars Visions has the advantage of potentially one day being a part of the Star Wars universe. And something like the What If can never be a part of that. Never. because of Star Wars and the way it has played to its strengths of we only have one story and everything else is the multiverse. And then I think if you start mixing the real with the multiverse, the other dimensions, I think that's where it gets really comic booky, and I think Star Wars loses its value. I'd much rather see, in my opinion, things like Star Wars Visions, where yes, it's not canon, but there's nothing truly saying that, because the way Star Wars stories are created and told and perceived, there can be renditions of these characters that are later introduced. So let's say a character like F is introduced in the Mandoverse, an Heir to the Empire movie, right? That character is there. But that character's story is still a question mark. And you can assume as a fan that yes, potentially, maybe all these things have happened. Why? Well, there's actually a really great example, like Thrawn. Thrawn is the perfect example of what a Star Wars Visions character can be like in the new Disney timeline. In the new canon, that helps not just preserve, but ultimately benefit the rest of the Star Wars story. Because that's Thrawn. We know the history of Grand Admiral Thrawn. We've seen it both in Legends and the new canon. And there are so many books that I have, Thrawn Alliances, all of these fantastic books. You have the Chiss Ascendancy and everything that they're building Thrawn. And even with what we know of the Heir to the Empire and the comics and things like that, from what, oh my gosh, Outbound Flight is amazing. I'm getting carried away because freaking Thrawn stories is so damn good. But you think about all of those stories, and while, yeah, sure, we have this new canon story for Thrawn, but maybe these other stories existed at one point. Maybe versions of these stories existed as well. Yes, maybe not every single detail could be true, but if they have the same beginning, if they have the same end, and maybe some minor details in there, you can find a way to fit them in the Star Wars universe. Maybe not the entire shape, maybe not the entire fit, but you can bring them in together. And even with a character like Thrawn has been the greatest example of that. Star Wars Visions characters can't have that. But when you try to move around things and fit them, like a what-if character, I just think the overall continuity of Star Wars suffers and loses its value. Because then there's nothing really making it different from the DC universe and how many times they reset and recast, and the Marvel universe and how many times they reset and recast and reboot, how many Spider-Mans there are, It's just one of those things where I think that's ultimately the problem with the superhero genre, is that you already know the story, and you have to see the story over and over again and again. And that's not a bad thing, because Star Wars is also a retelling of the story over and over again. But when you take characters that ultimately are a what if, and a what if is a multiverse, I just think it's going to ruin the rest of Star Wars. And again, I am very excited for the idea of a what if story, because there are some major strengths to see from an actual studio, that has really good creativity, beautiful animation. It's no longer something that was created 20 plus years ago. We have a great idea of, the entire storyboard that are working on movies and things like that to go over decisions that probably happened, that might have happened. Maybe these were stories, that we find out in the archives later, are parts of art books, for instance, like the Mandalorian art books and stuff, or, the Rise of Skywalker, wherever these books that you have, and you've heard about these rumors of, well, we were thinking about doing this with Darth Maul, we were thinking about doing this with Count Dooku and using 2 lightsabers. Maybe that's where the strength can come in for What If. And that's where I'm honestly most curious about, is to see those finally hit, reality in some form. So I no longer have to dream about it. I actually get a version of this, But there are stories in Star Wars, right, that can be told. And that's my problem. That is my main problem, is not just what I was telling you about with the multiverse and things like that and recasting. My biggest fear is that those resources, that creativity, that writer room is not being used for stuff like The Old Republic, I mean, even the High Republic. Even stuff that's further down the road into the sequel trilogy. And you can talk about things like, well, I'm not really sure if they can handle the Old Republic correct. I think those are very real concerns. Because you know what? We have seen it justified because of certain TV shows and movies the way they have turned out. I can't stop talking and criticizing enough about Kenobi, and I certainly... We've seen the criticisms with the sequel trilogy that I understand, And I still want the Old Republic. I want the Old Republic almost more than anything else. I want versions of the Clone Wars that we've seen with Star Wars Rebels and, the Clone Wars animated series, video games for the Mandoverse, for the sequel trilogy, even for the High Republic. And the High Republic, I think, in my opinion, has been underappreciated to a lot of the fandom because it's been rejected because it's not the Old Republic. And I don't think the High Republic is better than the Old Republic because the Old Republic has been around and it was a staple. It was an anchor for hardcore Star Wars fans that could really dive into something that was truly theirs. And the High Republic is that for a lot of new generation Star Wars fans. And I am one of those fans. But at the end of the day, I still feel like resources should be going to stories like that. Because we have the new Jedi, the new Jedi Adventures and stuff like that with Nubs, and he's really cute and everything, but it's a very young show for a young audience, and they seem to be doing well with it. It's getting any nominee awards. I mean, they're making more of it, which means it's making money, and they're profiting off something, and they're profiting off some type of fan base. That's why they're making more. And at the end of the day, I just kind of wish we had versions of that for the Old Republic. We had versions of that for a Mandoverse. And that's what I want. I want versions of these stories to be talked about in eras that we know and we've come to know and that we love, like the Old Republic. Or maybe even eras that we haven't seen yet. And I think the High Republic is a really great advantage for a lot of these shows to start building and kind of, I don't want to say reconfirming, but more so persuading people to get into this universe that they haven't got into yet because they're afraid that it's not as good as what came before. Like the Old Republic. That's what I want. I love the idea of what if. But what if we did the same thing and put those resources into previously established verses and characters and stories that we've come to know for years and years when there was no Star Wars being made? That's what I want, man. That's what I'm missing. And you can do that with freaking video games. You can do that with comics and books. Oh man, I can't tell you how bad I would love an anime, or not even an anime, just animation on the Old Republic. And then give me characters that I've never heard of, that I've never seen in the Old Republic, but they're going along and they're around the world of the Mandalorian world, the war, the hyperspace wars, and Malik and Revan and Bastila, even Star Wars: The Old Republic, the MMO, had done such a great job with fleshing out years and years, hundreds of years of Star Wars stories. Even if you want to tell a story, like something like to the depth level of Arcane, and really start the expansion of the Republic, finding the Sith, the genocide of the Sith, and how the Republic ultimately becomes the villains in the rest of this. And then you start to see why the Sith became the Sith. You can do the 100-Year War again with the Dawn of the Jedi, and then ultimately create these stories, that, maybe they go into the Knights of the Old Republic remake, and just like Star Wars Clone Wars, maybe they're precursors to the things like Star Wars Rebels, but in that era of Star Wars, in the Old Republic, in that era of the High Republic, maybe even something like the sequel trilogy which honestly didn't really get enough world building, didn't really get enough enhancing into the Aftermath series to really get us ready for the sequel trilogy. I would have loved 10 years of that world building before we got an episode 7. Would have turned out the same? I don't know. But at the very least, there would be more resources and animation for a lot of this stuff that we never got. Oh man, and I just think about the idea so often, and I'm not sure if Lucasfilm is, letting these details slip because they want to see people's perception and views on these things. Or, this is often how production works, and we hear about these things years later until, there's actually progress being worked. Maybe there's a trailer coming out in the next year. So who knows what's actually out there and on their shelves. But I do hope that we get to see these ideas that I'm talking about, because the Old Republic is overdue. An actual versions of these video games and stories of High Republic, the Mandoverse, the sequel trilogy, even stuff that we haven't seen before, it's all overdue. And I hope Lucasfilm takes the same amount of risk that they have with not only the sequel trilogy, but even something with the High Republic. You can say what you want about the High Republic, but the care that they've done specifically for the High Republic has been quality for them. And while the books may not be selling as much as a certain side of the fandom wants you to believe, they are profiting and they are making more of these things. And they're getting awards. And that is more than enough for Lucasfilm to have enough motivation to continue to create stories in that verse. And I just wish we had the same level of care for the Old Republic. For the Mandoverse. But going back to the what if stories, I think it's cool. I'm down. And I would really love to see a version of Anakin Skywalker that never turned to the dark side. I would love to see Luke Skywalker turning to the dark side in Return of the Jedi. I would love to see Palpatine winning. And I would love to see Finn being completely fleshed out as a true Jedi in that form to help Rey rebuild the new Jedi Order. There's a lot of stories that I would love to see. But I just hope this idea isn't replacing something like a canon Star Wars vision, like an Old Republic series, that is given us to in the Blur studios of animation that we saw with the video games of Star Wars: The Old Republic. There are so many fantastic ideas being made. I just hope it's not without us sacrificing the rest of the core of Star Wars. Because the day that we see a Star Wars movie get retconned, the day that we see Star Wars being recast to retell, stories like A New Hope or the sequel trilogy or whatever movies that you don't like to see, I think that's where Star Wars ultimately loses its greater value. And then it becomes a franchise that is just like the rest of the stuff that we've seen in the entertainment. You can say what you want about the sequel trilogy and things like that, and there's a lot of people that, in their right, they believe that Star Wars isn't the same. I just believe right now that there is still potential and opportunity for these stories to be fleshed out and created something new for everyone to enjoy, no matter what part of the fandom you're a part of. And I just hope something like What If doesn't take that opportunity away of something like an Old Republic series. That's it. But if you got this far, I just want to say thank you for coming to the channel, fam. Again, I'm just a regular scrub-dub guy who made this channel because I never had anyone really to talk about Star Wars to, and I'm glad that some people are listening to me, I was watching this one channel recently about how this one guy had made a YouTube channel to talk about gaming stuff and what's happening in the industry, and he didn't have notoriety. He wasn't a popular person. He didn't have influence. He was just a guy talking about games. And his channel ultimately grew because other people were watching his channel, like larger influencers like Asmongold and other people. And it's inspiring to see that. And over these last couple of years, as I was just a reactor, there's a lot of stuff that I haven't done, specifically when it involves lore, that I want to do on this channel. And I used to talk about this with so many other people back in the day, when I was finding out about the comics and the expanded universe, and I never had anyone to really share that with. And I kind of still don't. And so that's why I ultimately do these shows, these podcasts, is because someone's listening. It may not be hundreds of people, but even like the little 6 people that watch me, that's everything to me. I do envision myself sitting at a cafeteria table and just talking about Star Wars stuff with you, whether you hate it or not. And it's, whether negative or positive, man, I just want to say thank you for frickin' coming here and talking with me. Especially recently, the last couple months, these videos have gotten so much more traction that I'm not used to. I'm just used to me talking into a void and it being absorbed and, never like reciprocated or replied to. So it's awesome. And thank you for even listening to this stuff. There's always one place you can come. and talk about Star Wars. And that's the Dark Temple, baby. Visited by Mara Jade, Luke Skywalker, and Kyle Katarn, and so many of the Force sensitives like yourself. And I'll see you around, fam. Thank you for coming to Unlock Knowledge, and I hope you subscribe. Deuces.